Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy,
where we're expanding the conversation around Catholic sexuality.
We're your hosts, Ellen and Kathleen. All right, welcome back to Charting Toward Intimacy. We have been on a break for a little while. I think the last recording that Kathleen and I did was like the first week of December or something. And now we're in mid-January. So, but this episode's not coming out until like end of January. So I'm not going to turn it around like in 2 days.
That's right. We are post holidays and, back to the normal.
Yeah. Trying to get back into routines, kids back in school. And impossible. I mean, my kids aren't in school, but
mine are.
I have little ones. But yeah, we are excited to be back and recording. And if you are a longtime listener of the podcast, you might have noticed that the intro was just ever so slightly different. And I just before we jump into this topic, I just want to comment on that a little bit. So first of all, you may have noticed that I'm not the only host. Ellen here is not the only host. Kathleen is officially my co-host. I'm so excited to kind of have changed the format of the podcast to this because, first of all, Kathleen is so fun to talk to.
Depends on the day you're talking to, really.
But just, she and I we're both instructors in different methods. We've got a lot of background in fertility science. And so we can bring you guys a lot of information on that end. And then we both have just different backgrounds in different aspects of theology and church life and living NFP. And so we can really bring, I think, us together makes a really nice conversation and a really nice bolster of information.
And I'll say, too, that we're both just also on the journey,
right,
along with all of you, too.
We have not arrived.
We have not arrived, and we don't plan to arrive anytime soon,
no.
Right? So, and I think that's what I love so much about doing this with you, Ellen, is that even when we're not recording, right? We're like Marco Poloing each other,
right?
Throughout the day with what do you think of this? Do you think, all questions, and just to have that person that you can actually go to, it's not, you don't always have somebody that you can go and talk to about, sexuality or NFP
or discernment or
right, who shares the same perspective as you. And I love having that with you. And then I love also being able to invite all of you listeners into that as well with us.
Right.
It's just a really special space to kind of be in.
Yeah. I highly recommend because I've since starting the podcast, and if you've been listening for a while, you've heard me say this before, don't put yourself on an NFP island, find someone to talk NFP with. And when I started the podcast, I had or I still have local friends that we could chat about those things, but not to the level that I can chat with Kathleen about them. And I think it's because we are out of each other's lives. We're on opposite sides of the country. We're not necessarily friends with each other's families. Not that we wouldn't be.
Right.
But it's
right, yeah.
we're able to talk about things on a much deeper level. I think because we're only friends with each other, and we're not, I'm not seeing her extended family or her husband, and she's not seeing mine. And so we're able to talk about difficulties with sexuality or discernment or things like that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for a friend that's in your life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really true. It's an interesting, it's an interesting dynamic, but one that's really, really good.
Yeah.
It's been really good for me.
Anyway. Yeah. So anyway, I highly recommend, finding someone across the country.
Just go on Instagram and find a friend. Okay.
Just find a friend.
It's really not that hard.
Oh man. But yeah. Well, one great piece of advice if you're looking for that type of friend is just bring it to God. Say, Lord, I'm looking for someone that I can share this journey with, because it's a struggle and I want to have someone that I can talk to and just be able to just send them a Marco Polo about something that is difficult with sexuality without any intro.
Yeah. It's like the 21st century equivalent of like a pen pal.
Exactly. Yeah.
You just, yeah.
Texting Marco Polo. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's great.
That's what we do.
So anyway, so there's Kathleen and a little bit of our friendship.
Right.
And then you might have also noticed that instead of saying where we are expanding the conversation around natural family planning, we are now expanding the conversation around Catholic sexuality. Something that we recognized was one, looking back at 2022's podcast episodes, the top 5 most popular podcast episodes were about sex, not necessarily NFP. Yeah. And we recognized that there was a void in the conversation. There's and this isn't that we are gonna stop talking about NFP. That is absolutely still a part of this conversation, and there will still be episodes that are like focused on NFP, and what we're going to talk about today is definitely going to be like more focused on NFP, but we are also going to expand that conversation out a little bit into things like libido, desire, sexuality, just your marriage and your relationship and intimacy in that, things just a little bit like zoomed out from NFP, because and I think what we're going to get into a little bit today with this topic is NFP is not just this single rule that you just need to follow. If you're really going to be practicing NFP, it needs to be integrated into a full understanding of the reason for the gender difference and Catholic sexuality as a whole, and like Catholic moral theology around like sexuality.
Yeah, it's just one piece of Catholic sexuality, really.
Yeah.
It's not its own, thing necessarily. It's
right.
It does. You're exactly right. It requires an entire understanding, of Catholic sexuality as a whole.
And I think when we get into a spot where we're just really griping about NFP, it's not NFP that's the problem. It's a lack of an understanding of this whole picture, of the whole picture of Catholic sexuality. So I think we sort of like beat around the bush on like the specific topic of this episode. But what we're talking about is, why do you use NFP? Mm-hmm. Is your heart in it? Or are you just kind of checking a box to follow the rules? Before we like jump, sorry, I'm like totally monopolizing this conversation.
Do it.
Before we jump too far, I just want to say that everything we're going to talk about is not to scold you for, quote, practicing NFP wrong. That is absolutely not the point of this discussion. What we want to do is pull on your heartstrings a little bit and reflect on what your relationship is with natural family planning, and try to recognize, like, where can I go deeper? Where can I learn more? Where can I lean on God more in this relationship? And then the other thing that I want to say is that there is a beautiful faith to simply following a rule, even if you don't understand it. Mm-hmm. There absolutely is beautiful faith in that. And so if you're listening to this going, I am just checking a box, I'm just checking the box of NFP and it frustrates me or whatever, that there is beautiful faith in that, because you recognize the truth, like you recognize that there is truth to this rule, and that you should follow it, and that like that's a good thing to follow the rule, right? And that is okay if that's where you're at in your journey right now. And we want to call you to maybe take a baby step further from that.
There's a real humility to that. It's a total absence of pride, saying, oh no, this doesn't make any sense and I know better. It's no, I trust in the church. And even though I can't quite understand this, I'm going to continue to trust in the church. Mm-hmm. And that is, just like you said, there's a beautiful faith in that.
Yeah. So please don't walk away from this episode going, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible Catholic.
No, you're an awesome Catholic.
You're a great Catholic because
you're probably better than those of us that understand it.
Right. Because the goal is striving. You are striving to you're striving to follow God's call. And that's one of the beauties of our Catholic faith is that we have the magisterium who has set out very clear rules on certain things. And we can, it's absolutely appropriate to just follow those rules, even if we don't understand them. But it's also important and appropriate to learn the why and get connected with why.
Yeah. And I guess let me ask the question. If we are like, what could be the first step? If you are checking a box, what is the first step to understanding? And I think, I kind of think there are times, I mean, I do understand. I understand, for the most part, I think, on most days, I'll say, I understand the why behind why I practice NFP, and I believe in it and I love it, which is why I became an instructor, all this kind of stuff. But, and I know we've talked about, this isn't like a secret. I know we've talked about this in other podcast episodes. My husband feels very differently.
Yeah. And hopefully we're going to get him on to an episode
guys, stay tuned.
To share his thoughts and opinions. They're valid. Yeah. They are valid thoughts and opinions, even if he hates NFP.
They're very strong. They're strong and they're valid.
Yeah.
But so, he's very much a person who's checking the box. And I think we started our marriage with both of us just checking the box, right? Like, this is what we need to do. This is what we're going to do. And he continues to check a box, but again, in a way that is just like, because I know his struggle with it, it is so beautiful to see that he won't back down from it, even though he really dislikes it.
That and there
dislikes it, right?
Beautiful faith in that.
It is.
So I don't know if this would necessarily be like the first step. I think everybody's first step is going to look a little bit different, but maybe we should talk about like a little bit why the church calls us to use NFP. Mm-hmm. And first off, the church doesn't actually call us to use NFP.
That's true. That's a fact.
We say that a lot, but this is not a call of married couples to use NFP.
No, it's not. It's an option.
It's a valid option. It is a valid option. And so if we flip the narrative a little bit, because I think, so here's the narrative that I see a lot. I hate NFP because it doesn't allow me to have sex with my spouse when I want. Well, the other option, if you are trying to avoid pregnancy, is complete and total abstinence. Mm-hmm. So I think that might even be the first step for a lot of people is whenever you hear your mind saying that, just flipping it in your head to, I appreciate that NFP does allow me to have sex with my spouse at least some of the time when we're trying to avoid pregnancy. Because it's not a question of using NFP or using contraception. That's not a choice.
Right.
Because contraception is not a choice. It's not an option.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll definitely have some episodes where we get more into contraception and why that's just absolutely not an option.
Yeah.
But I don't think we want to like dive into that too much here. We can just kind of like recognize that that's a true statement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead?
I totally just lost my train of thought.
Oh, that's okay.
I like how to.
I know it looked like you had a thought. That's why I was like,
did.
Go ahead.
And then it was gone.
Well, I can keep chatting. You can just interrupt me when your thought
keep
comes
going.
back.
I'll interrupt you when it comes back.
But I think a lot of times just the things that we say in our head really they change our opinion of things. And so if we just take that simple step to flip that script in just recognizing like, look, I have this option of NFP, and the beauty that NFP does is it actually shows me, you know, when myself or my wife, depending on who you are in this relationship, shows when the woman is fertile. And since we're trying to avoid pregnancy, we can with confidence come together during times of the cycle when we can be sure that she is not fertile. And that like what a gift that NFP is, that God thinks sex is so important that even when you recognize that you should avoid pregnancy, he gives us a tool to still come together with our spouse.
Yeah.
That's how
so
important he recognizes sex is.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. You know, it is just like you say, it's a flipping the script.
Mm-hmm.
You know, do you see the glass as half empty or half full?
Right.
It's the exact same concept that, yeah, it's because, I mean, think back how many, you know, like 100 years ago, right? Like we didn't have this science.
Right.
We didn't have this, you know, this ability. It was
coming up on 100 years ago, we stared to have the Rither method, but
that's
we're
true.
getting close.
Exactly.
We're getting close to having to say things like 150 years ago.
Yeah. Woohoo! But yeah, you know, it was either if you like absolutely could not get pregnant or did not want to get pregnant, like you just really didn't have the option, right? I mean, and I think there are still people today who kind of feel that way. It's like, I mean,
right. Unfortunately,
you know what I mean? But
I feel bad for them.
I know, it's just kind of like I have, if I ever want to have sex with my spouse again, I just need to have contraception because I can't get pregnant or, you know, for whatever reason, or I don't ever want to be pregnant again. You know, it's like, we just have to be on contraception. So that mentality is definitely still out there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but that's such a cool way to think of it, that like God has given us this tool so that we can still come together, that we can still, I mean, celebrate the sacrament that we, you know, that we live every day. Renew our vows, as we say, right? Like that's what sex is. It's renewing your wedding vows every single time. That's a really cool way to actually to think about it. And I'll say, you know, whenever I have something that I don't understand, and like I said, I understand, you know, the whole NFP thing from a church perspective on most days. And the reason I say on most days is because when, you know, my husband and I are kind of like feeling disconnected on our, you know, understanding of it, or it's causing some friction in our relationship, those are the days where I'm like, Lord, why? I really don't get it. Why, you know? And then I always just have to like cycle back and just be like, you know, this, like, you know, get those little pieces of your brain back. But whenever I'm in those spots, with anything, not just with NFP, I always go to either church documents or voices in the church that I really trust. There's some authors and everything that, you know, that I've really come to trust their opinions and their feelings and their thoughts on things. So doing your research really and trying to understand. And I think that's something that is so in our culture today. I feel like there's sort of this like epidemic of wanting to remain ignorant sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Wanting to like have our cake and eat it too, and not wanting to be told that we're wrong. And so refusing to actually look into it. And I think this is especially prominent around matters of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think
I think this is especially prominent around matters of sexuality.
And matters of sexuality. Exactly. It's like, no, but if I look into this and there's something that, makes sense, then that means I need to change the way that I live.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to refuse to look into it,
yeah.
But if you are a person, thankfully, this isn't the problem for you. If you are a person who's kind of checking off the box, you are living the way you're being called to live. How much better if you could actually understand it.
Right.
So really, and I would say, Ellen, what are some of those resources that you would really go to?
Yeah. So I would recommend starting with the catechism and going ahead and raise your hand if you're reading the catechism in a year.
Me.
I would go ahead and if you're reading Catechism in a Year, you heard Father Mike say, this is a book, not a resource encyclopedia, but go ahead and use it like an encyclopedia. Because we're not going to get to this section for quite a few months.
Well, not a while, yeah.
Go ahead and look up marriage, sex, go ahead and look up things like chastity, and read through those sections. And what I'd recommend is don't just read the paragraph that's referenced, like read the section that reference paragraph is under, because again, it is a book.
Right.
It just happens to have all of those lovely reference numbers.
Yeah.
And get the background. The next things that I would recommend would be Humana Vitae or Casti Connubii. Those are both papal documents. Humana Vitae is short. Casti Connubii is longer. Humana Vitae is newer. Casti Connubii is older and has a little bit more difficult language. So you can just kind of where you're at. But I think Casti Connubii talks a little bit more about the why. Humana Vitae is more just like NFP is the option. Natural means of fertility regulation is the option. But you can still get some great stuff out of it. Then I'd recommend a couple of Christopher West books. Theology of the Body for Beginners would be a great place to start. Good News About Sex and Marriage, also a really good one. That one is in a Q&A format, and so you can just kind of like look at the questions and maybe just like go straight to some of the ones that apply to the questions that you have. The only thing about the Good News About Sex and Marriage is I don't think he goes enough into that why of NFP in those questions. I think he's more talking about a lot of other aspects of sexuality. So I'm not sure that's going to you're not going to read that book and go, oh, I have my why behind NFP now. You might have your why behind some other great stuff, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I think Holy Sex by Gregory Popcak.
Oh, I love that book.
Has a good section on NFP. That one's really good. And then there's another book by Christopher West called Heaven's Song. This is going to give you, I really recommend this book. Now, you need to be ready to receive this book. This book is things you don't hear in the church about sexuality. It's beautiful. But the book might make you blush. It's about the Song of Songs. It goes deep into the Song of Songs, the relationship that it has with liturgy and our church as a whole, and our personhood and our relationship of God to man. That book will give you your why behind NFP. But I'd really recommend Theology of the Body for Beginners before you read Heaven's Song, because Heaven's Song is it's talking a lot about JP2's theology of the body, specifically the addresses that JP2 did not publicly give. So a little fun fact, there's a couple of
Interesting,
addresses on the Song of Songs that John Paul II recognized it was kind of it was too much for a wide, broad audience to, just say some of the, like, just a little too tender of information.
Yeah.
Not that we as Catholics shouldn't know it. It was like a little too much for a broad audience. And so that's what Heaven Song really goes into, some of those addresses that weren't given. And so I think it would be really good to have kind of a little base of theology of the body before you jump into Heaven Song.
Yeah. And I think too, and I think I have not read Heaven Song yet, but we were talking about it not that long ago. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but it really kind of explains does it not explain like how sex is really a reflection of like the love of God for us, right? And Trinitarian love and all of that kind of stuff.
He does go into that kind of stuff in that book.
Which I think is such an important thing that we need to remember. At the end of the day, like we see like when we practice NFP, we're looking at it like under a microscope.
Right.
Like we see it very close up, the nitty gritty, every little detail. And it's hard to understand the big picture of it all. And so, to really get to that point, we need to back up and we need to remember that, like, okay, sex in and of itself is a reflection of God's love for man and Trinitarian love and all of these things.
And man's openness to God.
Yeah. Exactly. And so being able to really bring that to prayer, if we're checking off the box and really struggling to understand this teaching, to bring that to prayer and say, Lord, I know that this is a revelation of you. Just show me how, I don't know. It's, and it's sex, but it's also like, we talked about it before. Do we have to practice NFP? No, we don't have to practice NFP. You can, by all means, go ahead and just, never
love your spouse, never chart.
Love your spouse. And
see what happens.
Feel called and just accept, the whatever comes from that. That's
just be careful in that mindset to not turn it into a test to God, because that's where it's really easy in that mindset to just say, oh, like, God's just going to take care of me. And so I do not need to practice self-control with my spouse. And we can just come together whenever we want in a more lustful way, perhaps. We are not called to just test God like that.
Yes. And that's the other point I was going to make is like,
oh, sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's fine. It's just always remembering that call to responsible parenthood too. Which I know we've talked about in previous episodes. And that comes from Humana Vitae,
the responsible parenthood. And I really recommend checking out really the definition of responsible parenthood, because I think, I'm just totally going to throw a wrench in this. Maybe this is a future podcast episode. I think that we could replace natural family planning with responsible parenthood with that phrase.
Yeah.
And that it would actually be a much more accurate reflection of what we are, what everyone is called to.
Yes.
And how when you're practicing responsible parenthood, you can utilize fertility awareness and discernment to to practice responsible parenthood. But
because that's the thing.
That would be a really good podcast episode, actually.
That would be a really good episode, because prayer and discernment are the crucial element to NFP, right?
Right.
Like, it's fertility awareness paired with constant ongoing prayer and discernment for family life.
Yes.
So that's a really good point. Oof. I think we need to start writing some things out and,
I'm going to put that on our list of podcast ideas right now after we finish recording.
Right now. And let's talk about what we can do to start changing some vernacular,
Loving it. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.